when you ask pupils what they want for how their teacher can help them, they just say they want the teachers to talk to them. We know that really quick feedback is the most impactful. Them having the bookmarked, getting it back a week later, that's gone, hasn't it? So that really quick verbal feedback can be really useful.
Welcome to the Leading With podcast. My name's Nicola Allen and I'm Managing Director of Educake, and I am delighted to be with the phenomenal Tracey Baxter. So Tracey is an independent science consultant with extensive experience of supporting secondary schools. She's hugely respected in the world of secondary science education and has the ability to make you see classroom practice with fresh eyes. She's practical, sharp and grounded in what works. Welcome, Tracey, and tell us a little bit about your background.
Oh, thanks, Nick. Thank you for your kind words. I'm, like as you said, I'm an independent science consultant. I'm a science teacher at heart because once you're a teacher, you're always a teacher. I work directly with some schools and trusts to support science, whether that's science teachers, science leaders. Got lots of different contracts with different people, so STEM learning, I do quite a lot of work. The awarding organisations, author textbooks and edit textbooks. Lots of different hats, which makes it really interesting.
Today we're going to be looking at assessment and, with your vast knowledge of schools, what we can do to improve it and give some real practical advice to secondary science departments across England.
Okay, it's been a great shift. The shift to low stakes or no stakes assessment has been great, and where it's used well, it's amazing. I think what we used to get, we had lots of schools, over quite a few years now, have introduced that consistent start to lessons, that consistent routine. Sometimes that was just seen as a settler activity. So, I've seen students sort of doing word searches or something that doesn't really require any thinking. I think we've seen a shift in most schools now where it's some kind of low stakes, no stakes assessment that is focused on retrieving what they've done before, which is great. It's great for, quite a few reasons, but it's really good because it can be really positive start to the lesson. It does get them back to thinking about things that they've done before. Really, the other thing it's good for, where you've had students that have been absent, have come back into your lesson, they can start to reconnect with some of the learning rather than feel like, they're completely out of it and don't know what's going on. The best thing with that low stakes or no stakes assessment is that as a teacher, you get some feedback, as do the pupils, but it really is about that confidence building. So saying from the off, you're welcome in the lesson, you're succeeding, and you're succeeding from the off. So I always talk about an 80-20 rule, that if you set a quiz like that, you should be aiming for the pupils in front of you to be able to get about 8 out of 10 right, to build the confidence, but to have somewhere else to go. So if that's the start at the end of the lesson, you're gaining some information about where they're at, but actually you're just reinforcing to them that they can do it and they can succeed.
That's amazing. So many teachers identify skill development as important, especially in practical and mathematical context, but often the assessment of these skills lags behind. What do you think some of the effective ways teachers can explicitly assess skills and not just knowledge in science lessons?
Yeah, this is really common. It's a really easy trap to fall into. So we're so focused, we've got such a content-heavy curriculum in science, haven't we, that testing that content really does take over. Lots of departments that I work with have moved to saying, okay, we identify there's a gap in skills, such as practical skills, and they'll say that that's part of their development plan, and it'll be there in the development plan as it should be. But then when you look at the curriculum plans or lesson plans and go into lessons, although they might be delivering some practical work and some practical skills, they haven't explicitly identified what it is they're trying to get from that. We were at Heads of Science in Birmingham yesterday. We were speaking a lot about practicals, weren't we, and practical assessment and getting that really purposeful practical. And one of the things that they identified was, even where they've identified the purpose of the practical, they're not actually then assessing that. So I think the first step is, if a practical skill is your purpose for that lesson, it needs to be there in the objectives and outcomes. So for me as a teacher, if it's there on that first slide in my objectives and outcomes, I'm far more likely to go back to assess that. And it might just be at the end of the lesson, it's a quick mini whiteboard activity, or it's a bit, verbal question and answer. But that's the first step. It needs to be there. It needs to be there. If it's in your department development plan, it needs to be there in your objectives and your outcomes, and it needs to be there in your assessments as well. Whether they're, your quick quizzes, your end of topic assessments and end of year assessments, it just needs to feature everywhere.
At the Heads of Science session yesterday that you ran, very, very, very insightful, you referenced a framework for practicals.
Yep.
Could you give a bit of an overview? So I think lots of the people listening would find that really beneficial.
Yeah, so the Gatsby practical benchmarks, yes, we looked at those. It's really interesting. They were developed in 2017. A hard copy went into every secondary science department, and still we come across lots of teachers, even teachers that were around then, have never come across those. And we've obviously got lots of newer leaders that haven't been in post as long as that, so they haven't seen that. And they just give you, based on international studies, meta-analysis for the data, what good practical science looks like. So there are 10 benchmarks. And the ones that from the, we did a little survey yesterday of what people think they probably need to develop more in. One was that planning for practical science. So making sure that it's purposeful, making sure that we're assessing it was a big thing that came up as well. So that's quite common that I see that even where departments have moved, a really positive move to say, we identify the purpose of a practical, and if we identify that this is the best practical, for example, to put this bit of content into context, if it's the best for this group of pupils, then it's the best for all of our pupils, and we're doing that consistency across the department. Some have made really good inroads to that, and what lags behind, which isn't surprising, is the assessment of it. So they've still got that to work on in most places, I would say.
So thinking of assessment, live marking is a much discussed strategy. Some praise its immediacy, others worry it becomes a tick and flick exercise. What in your view separates impactful live marking with effective practices?
This has been a real shift, and it's a real shift in thinking for lots of teachers. So it really does divide people. But I think because it is a big change in the way that you think, when we've gone from particularly more experienced teachers that we had to, mark every piece of work. We did do that tick and flick. So it is a shift in thinking. It's a really positive move when it's done well. So when you ask pupils what they want for how their teacher can help them, they just say they want the teachers to talk to them. We know that really quick feedback is the most impactful. Them having the bookmarked, getting it back a week later, that's gone, hasn't it? So that really quick verbal feedback can be really useful. So I think the real downside of live marking, where it goes wrong, is where people have differing expectations or unrealistic expectations. So in my experience, science departments that have really gone for this, and it's a whole school thing, their reluctance is, I can't mark everybody's work every lesson. And that's true, you can't. That needs to be, that's one of the unrealistic things where sometimes we'll get senior leaders saying, well, why hasn't everybody's piece of work been marked? And if you do that in a lesson, that does become just a walking round version of tick and flick. So the best way to approach it is to really prioritise who you're going to visit and what for a particular piece of work. So lots of science lessons now have priority seating, so they know where the PP students are sat, they know where the SEND students are sat. They will know where students have been absent and come back in. They'll know the ones that are below target. They'll know the ones they really need to challenge at the top end. And it's about deciding before you get to that independent practice, who will I check on today and whose work will I mark? And the other really useful way of using it is bringing pupils out to the front and you speak to them individually. And if that is the norm in your classroom and that everybody gets to do that at some point, then it's not a big issue to go and stand by the teacher and talk to them. So it is really effective, but it is a shift in thinking for some. So I know schools where they've moved away from any marking outside of lessons, but I see teachers sneaking books home because they just can't let that go of looking at every piece of work in the book. But it's about being realistic in terms of how many people you can get to. You've seen a few people's work, it's really easy to pick up those common mistakes or common misconceptions or just common misunderstandings in what you've asked them to do. You can stop the whole class, you can reinforce that. It can be really, really effective. If you're realistic, be really effective because it's so quick and just helps pupils there and then. You can really challenge them as well. You can give them, I know some people use different coloured markers. This bit's really good. This bit needs rethinking. So you're just leaving them with that challenge to try and correct that themselves or improve it themselves. It can be really helpful for them and really helpful with teacher workload if we can just shift our thinking and go with it. But it takes practice. It's a different way of working.
And I bet it would really support building confidence as well, and getting the students used to having, being called to the front and just having a quieter conversation to, develop their learning. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you've probably seen many schools collect masses of assessment data but not actually act upon it. What are some of the practical ways that teachers and science departments can shift from simply generating data to using it meaningfully?
Yeah, historically, particularly in science, we have generated so much data, and we're talking about using spreadsheets to monitor sub-levels and parts of sub-level, it's just, it's crazy. But shifting to actually using the data, that's where we need to be going. And I think we are getting much better at it. We've got lots of tools now that can help us to do that. So we really need to think about not spending that time marking every piece of work in the book, only marking the really meaningful tasks where pupils have worked independently, for example, using what we can to mark those simple questions and focusing our efforts on ones that really need that teacher input to mark it. So whatever we can do to get that data generated for us, and we can do the bit of analysing it and then diagnosing what to do, or even better, we've got lots of tools now that will do part of that analysis for you. So, Educake is a really good example of that, and there are other platforms that do that as well, that not only are you not marking it, but you're not even doing the analysis bit of it. You're getting that really visual overview. AQA Insights, Edexcel have got a similar system, but those systems where it does even the analysis bit for you, and then you can really get down to, okay, this is what it's showing me. That just gives me a question of, they struggled with that, now I need to work out, that's the symptom, what do I diagnose, what is causing that, and therefore what can I do about it? So you're almost taking out the marking, the analysing, and you're moving on to, I'm going to diagnose and I'm going to plan to treat it.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
So when exam results come in, there's a tendency to focus on which topics are weak. But you've talked before about digging deeper into language, application and writing. How can teachers move from surface level analysis to insights that actually informs teaching?
Okay. Again, they've got loads of tools to help them now. It's just about making the most of them. Every year, I go through all the examiners' reports for, GCSEs particularly, across the different awarding organisations. And you've been at those sessions where I've given insights into generally what we see. And we see very similar themes and patterns across the different awarding organisations. And you know that I flick really quickly past that bit where I say, these are the very specific parts of topics that students struggle with. And they can see those in the examiner's report. I flick past those really quickly. I flag them, but I go past them really quickly for two reasons. One, if schools do any kind of analysis, it's usually starting with the topics. So if they're going to do anything, they will have done that. So I tend to leave that alone a little bit. But the other big thing is that topic, that spec point will not be tested in the same way next year. It might not even be tested next year. And therefore, looking for a problem with that and just trying to solve that isn't necessarily going to help you. It just won't. So it's worth looking at the bigger topics, because if you look at the bigger topics, you can go, okay, well, what was it about it? Do we need to change some wording in the way we're delivering those lessons? Do we need to include a different definition? Is there something missing completely? Did they just have a non-specialist teacher? So it's useful to a certain degree, but much more value where you've got, they're always going to have to do extended writing. They're always going to have practical skills tested. They're always going to have maths skills tested. Those AO3 questions, the practical around the analysis and the evaluation, they go across everything. So if you can work out where the strengths and weaknesses are in that, if you're treating it in one specialism, you're treating it across the board. So it can just give you much more value. So I really, really encourage teachers all the time to look at what are those transferable skills. And then it's the same thing. That only gives you, this is the problem. They're struggling with this. Then you need to diagnose why. So you need to go back and do those things of, Did we miss it out on a curriculum plan? Did they not have that taught because they had supply? Is it something that we need to sort of close that loop and change what we're doing? Is it that we need to practice that more? Do we need to take that back to Key Stage 3? Whatever your treatment of it, it just raises another question for you. But if you're doing it around those skills, it's transferable across everything. So it's much better. I really, really encourage teachers, and this is from my own experience, the hours wasted that I've done, say take year 11, that first mock that they do usually around November, the number of hours I've wasted doing question level analysis of every part of every question. And it doesn't really tell me much, because generally in November, all it tells me is that the students have done better in the thing that we just went over before the test, because they haven't done much revision, most of them, by then. If you can take that mock and just pick out some of the questions and not analyse all of it, because that's just probably pointless and workload would be huge, just take out some questions that focus on the extended writing, probably, because that's a challenge for most, some of the practical skills and some of the math skills, for example, the AO3 focus questions. Just pick out some key ones of those, just analyse those and look where those weaknesses are and those skills. In your next mock, analyse a similar style of question and the similar skills and see whether you're getting progress in those. So taking away the analysis of the whole thing, but looking around those skills instead. Even better, you could get, if it's only a few questions, you can give those bits back to the students and get them to rag rate, and that gets a bit of buy-in for them of how important these skills are and that they're going across everywhere. So yeah, skills, I think, and AO3 is sort of underrated a little bit, but it spreads across everything, so you've got much more gain in that.
That's really great sound advice. I've heard a lot about command words in the last few years.
Yep.
Do you think that's still going to be a problem moving forward with schools, where students are just missing the direction of what the command word is asking them?
Definitely, it's a challenge every year. And you've sat through enough Teach CPD that I think you can probably tell us which tricky command words there are. So every year we get describe and explain. Because students find it tricky to distinguish between the two, some students will describe, and when they're asked to explain, they'll either write nothing or they'll just describe again, a little bit louder, but it's the same thing that they're saying. So that's always an issue, and the number of times that comes up across a paper, even with some of your students, particularly higher tier students, if you get them to go through a paper, pick out what the command words are, which really highlights to them. Describe and explain is massive. So if they can get their head around that, they're onto a winner, really. And we have other ones that come up depending what's been asked that year, but we usually have something around calculate. If evaluate comes up, then that is always a challenge for students. Compare, it comes up quite a lot as well. So if you're going to just have to pick a couple, I would say describe and explain, distinguishing between those two, and even the simpler state and give. That's, state, give, describe, explain, distinguishing between those, and maybe compare. And then if you're talking about AO3 that I said before, if they can analyse, if they can evaluate and know what that means, again, they're just universal, aren't they? They're everywhere. So it's definitely worth focusing on the command words.
I've also heard lots about working scientifically coming up recently, where when students get to doing more of the required practicals, there's a little bit of a gap in knowledge on some of the basic skills, even going down to using a cylinder and actually measuring. What advice would you give to schools to really support that knowledge moving through from year 7, or even maybe moving from Key Stage 2 into Key Stage 3?
Yeah, we spoke a bit about this yesterday, didn't we? We looked at that 2024 cohort, which affected you because you had a son in the 2024 cohort, and that cohort last year had missed that. It really affected them on the Key Stage 3 because of lockdowns, and the impact that we think it probably had when we looked at how students did with those practicals. And we'd said yesterday there was a real difference in 2024 compared to other years when I've looked at the data, and it was across both AQA and EdExcel that chemistry was really tricky for students this year in terms of the practicals. So with biology fared better in required practicals. Students, even if they couldn't answer the specific question, they'd clearly seen that practical. They'd use microscopes, they'd even use quadrats, and that usually comes up as something that they've not done very well. So it was obvious that they were aware of the required practicals. Physics was a bit of a mixed bag. They could recall some of those practicals but couldn't explain the purpose of the steps or the apparatus. Chemistry, they were definitely less familiar across foundation and higher, less familiar with those practicals. And chatting to some of those heads of science, we've thought about it could be because those chemistry practicals are really similar. It could be that they didn't have the basics in Key Stage 3. It's probably a mix of it. It could be that we don't have the chemistry specialists because we're really struggling for chemistry specialists. Lots and lots of reasons, but I think this one has to come back to Key Stage 3. It's about going back to naming the apparatus, you know, doing sort of splat games with the apparatus, bingo, having the apparatus with little labels on around the lab, really taking it back to basics. And if you've got students in Key Stage 4, okay, you can't go backwards, but really taking it back to basics. So really encourage people. I talk about what, why, how questions. So with any required practical, as a specialist, and it's best if a specialist does it because we've got much more of an insight. So, you know, I'm a biologist, teach physics, but I would say to the physics specialist, just tell me the really basic, the what, the why and the how of this required practical, that I need to check that they've got that before I move on to a question in a different application or, you know, improving a method. So that, you know, what are we doing? What are we using? Is it, you know, a measuring cylinder or is it a beaker? Why are we doing it? Sorry, how are we doing it? So how are we going to carry that out? How are we going to do each step? How are we going to take measurements and why? Why are we doing that step? Why are we using that particular bit of apparatus? And just really getting those basics set in stone before you move on to the more challenging stuff.
That's really helpful. I've heard lots about context in exams coming up. I think Carrot Gate was the popular one where students weren't sure what to do with the carrot because a question came up usually that has a potato in the required practical. What would you say to teachers out there to just help them with that cultural capital that, you know, obviously we can't second guess because we don't know what's going to be on the exam papers?
It's really, they really do struggle with AO2. So AO2 doesn't just cover unfamiliar context, it covers things like calculations and some of the graph work as well, but actually the bit that students really struggle with is that application in a different context. You know, I taught A-level biology and then they would really struggle with it. So, you know, they'd come out going, Miss, you haven't even taught us about dandelions. I was like, it didn't matter that it was dandelions. So they've really, you know, that's, the students really struggle to be able to apply their knowledge. The best thing you can do is get them used to seeing things in a different context. I spoke to a teacher recently that was like, well, there's no point me getting them to practice different contexts because then they change it the next year. And I'm like, that's the point. It's AO2. If they didn't change it, it's not AO2. We've got to have that. They've got to have that proportion of questions that are in an unfamiliar context. Again, with lots of things, they take it back to Key Stage 3. In every topic, in every assessment or every bit of content, do you give them the opportunity to apply that to a different context? So yeah, they're not probably going to come across the same one, but actually they get used to looking at something and going, I don't know anything about that. And just trying to, again, it's a lot of it's confidence, just having the confidence to say, if I don't know about it, I'm probably not meant to know about it. And I just try to teach students to go, okay, let's look for clues. So things like not showing them the question, just showing them the stimulus material. What does this remind you of? And you can do that as a whole class. Cover the question up. What does this remind you of? Have we done anything like this before? What did we see? What did we do? So you can turn that into a whole class revision discussion, but also they're getting to grips with, okay, let's see, what do you think the question might ask? And they can start to predict what the question. So it's confidence again to engage with the material and unpick and look for the clues of what it might be about. But yeah, just preparing them for, you're going to see things that you haven't seen before, but it'll be linked to something and try and find the bit of science that you think it's about.
That's amazing. I know that there was reference to the diving brick at the bottom of the swimming pool a few years ago and everybody was a bit thrown by the measurement. Was it floating? So yeah, that's really, really sound advice.
But what you said there before as well, cultural capital, that's a real barrier for some students as well. So one example that we've had shared is it was a maths question actually, but the maths got lost because the students were asked about the area of Repatio and some of them didn't know that. We had a question in science that I know caught a lot of students that I work with out, that it was only about filtration. It was quite a simple question, but it used a cafetiere and they didn't know a cafetiere, a lot of them. So it's that, you can't prepare them for everything. We know that the awarding organisations are trying to be more accessible, and the platforms like Educake that students are working with are also taking on that accessibility. information and just really trying to make it that we are testing the science and we're not catching students out, because we're not trying to catch them out, we're trying to find out what they know and understand, aren't we?
Absolutely. So my final question for today, and it's possibly my favourite. So if you could wave the metaphoric magic wand and change one common assessment or feedback practice in schools tomorrow, what would it be and why?
Ooh, can I only have one? You know I'm greedy. Could I have two?
Go on then.
I could have about 5, but can I have 2? Okay, I'll have 2. Right, my first one would be to see more value in multiple choice questions. They're really undervalued and underrepresented. When they're designed well, as you know, when they're designed well, they're absolutely amazing for being a really quick way of testing knowledge and understanding of pupils and picking out those misconceptions that they might hold. So I do see that schools, science departments that are using multiple choice, they almost have to justify that sometimes to senior leadership team, because multiple choice questions are seen as low level, and they really don't have to be. And they're a really quick way of assessing, have students got this, or are they still holding some common misconception, are they making some common error? So they're hard to design them with those really well thought out distractor answers. And therefore, if you can find them somewhere else already done and that thinking's been done and build up your bank like that's absolutely amazing. But multiple choice questions, I think more people should use them, because that you can get so much information out of them and you can get them really quickly. And my other one would be, I would really, really love to wave a magic wand and have teachers not to justify when they've given verbal feedback. So we've still got schools that have to put a verbal feedback stamp on books when they've spoken to a pupil, or something has to be written to demonstrate that they've spoken to that pupil and that pupil has made some progress from that. That's not a good use of time.
No.
And that is about just justifying that you're doing what you're supposed to do. So I would love it that teachers were just trusted and given the time to talk to pupils and give them feedback that way, use the time effectively, not wasting it doing a silly stamp or having to write in books all the time.
Tracey, you've been fabulous.
Oh, thank you.
This is a podcast for Leading With. My name's Nicola Allen from Educake. Thank you.